For more than a decade, Clifton Powell carried something most of his fans never fully understood, a legal shadow that followed him from film set to film set, quietly costing him roles nobody ever explained losing. Now, at 70 years old, the actor who made America laugh as Pinky and broke hearts as Ray Charles's loyal road manager is finally speaking plainly about what that decade actually cost him, not just in dollars, but in trust, in sleep, in the way strangers looked at him on the street. What happened to Clifton Powell turns out to be a story about two very different kinds of judgment, one delivered by a courtroom and one delivered by an industry that rarely waits for the facts before making up its mind. Clifton Powell was born March 16, 1956, in Washington, D.C., and grew up in the Mayfair Mansions housing complex in the northeast corner of the city, a tough, tightly packed neighborhood. His mother died when he was only 4 years old, leaving him in the care of a father he has described as functionally dysfunctional, a man wrestling with alcoholism who simply couldn't provide the steadiness a small child needed. By 6, Powell was essentially raising himself, telling his father plainly that he no longer wanted or needed a babysitter after discovering the woman looking after him kept a home infested with rats. What saved him, by his own telling, wasn't a program or an institution. It was people. His father's girlfriend at the time, a woman named Imogene Johnson, had a teenage son named Darryl Harvey, who quietly took an 8-year-old Clifton under his wing, filling in for a father who often couldn't. Powell's older sister pulled him out to her house on weekends, specifically to get him away from the neighborhood, even while she was already raising children of her own. And a rotation of neighborhood teachers, the kind who'd bring a hungry kid lunch without making it a whole conversation, filled in the rest. Church every Sunday became another anchor, less about doctrine, Powell has suggested, than about simply being somewhere structured and safe on a regular basis in a neighborhood that offered very little of either. He has said plainly that without Darryl Harvey and that patchwork of adults, he'd likely have ended up locked up rather than sitting for interviews about his career. He never set out to become an actor. Football was the plan, the way it was for a lot of kids in his neighborhood, until a school production of Lil Abner at St. Anthony's changed the direction of his entire life, almost by accident. A teacher, a white instructor the students simply called Mr. R, cast him in the play after Powell, only half serious, mentioned he thought he could probably do that too. He went on to attend Emerson College in Boston, an unlikely destination for a kid from Mayfair Mansions, and started building a career the slow, unglamorous way, picking up small television and film roles through the 1980s, before landing a part in 1990's House Party, one of his earliest credited film appearances. Even in those early years, the industry's racial politics were already shaping which doors opened and which quietly stayed shut. In 1995, Powell was cast in a supporting role in Vampire in Brooklyn, the Eddie Murphy film, and left the production entirely after a sound technician on set treated him in a way Powell experienced as blatantly racist, reportedly telling him, when Powell asked not to run a microphone wire through his hair, that he could simply record his dialogue later rather than be accommodated on set. Powell walked. When he raised the incident with producers, according to his own account, nothing happened to the technician, and Powell simply finished the job and left without further comment, a pattern of quiet, costly principle that would repeat itself throughout his career. He has said he doesn't tolerate that kind of treatment, Not from a sound man, not from a producer, not from anyone, even when standing his ground meant losing work he badly needed. His real breakthrough came in 1993 with Menace to Society, the Hughes brothers' unflinching portrait of street life, where Powell's raw, coiled intensity caught the attention of casting directors across the industry. From there, the credits piled up fast. Dead Presidents, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, the Friday franchise, where his comedic timing as Pinky turned him into a genuine fan favorite, Rush Hour, and Norbit, each role sharpening a reputation as the actor-directors called when they needed someone who could turn menacing on command. And then, in the very next scene, turn completely disarming. Younger audiences who never watched a single one of his films still know his voice without realizing it, since Powell voiced Big Smoke, one of the most memorable characters in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, a role that introduced an entirely new generation to that same unmistakable, gravel-edged authority he'd spent years perfecting on screen. By 2004, that range had carried him to Ray, playing Jeff Brown, Ray Charles's loyal road manager opposite Jamie Foxx's Oscar-winning performance, a role sensitive and understated enough to earn Powell an NAACP Image Award nomination and prove, definitively, that his talent extended well past the hardened characters Hollywood kept handing him. That contradiction, praised for menace, passed over for warmth, was never an accident, and Powell has spoken about it with unusual candor. He's described being told outright by producers that he was too dark for certain roles. Once specifically for a television movie about civil rights icon Ruby Bridges, with one producer reportedly telling the director he was so dark it looked like he'd scare everyone. A separate producer on that same project pulled Powell aside afterward and told him plainly that he'd been their first choice, insisting the loss wasn't for lack of anyone fighting for him behind the scenes. He's said a nearly identical dynamic cost him a McDonald's commercial, an agency deciding, in his telling, that he simply read as too dark for the spot, despite a friend advocating for him internally. He's recounted an industry anecdote involving Wesley Snipes and a major talent agency instructing casting directors not to send anyone darker than Denzel Washington. And he's been candid that even decades into his career, he still gets followed in stores, still finds himself explaining to strangers on airplanes why he's sitting in first class. Powell has been careful to note that conditions have genuinely improved since he started, that audiences now embrace far darker-skinned leading actors than the industry once allowed. But he's also been blunt that the bias never fully disappeared. It just learned to speak in softer language, dressed up as market concerns or target demographics, rather than said outright. He's carried that same refusal to simply absorb mistreatment onto nearly every set he's worked, sometimes at real professional cost. He's spoken about walking off a production rather than mock Harlem's cultural history for a joke he found disrespectful, and about confronting network crews, including, on at least one occasion, Teamsters he says he later learned held affiliations he found genuinely alarming. He's also weighed in publicly on tensions within the black entertainment community itself, pushing back after director Spike Lee made comments Powell felt were unfairly harsh toward another black actor, saying plainly that he has no respect for anyone willing to tear down a fellow black entertainer in front of the mainstream press. It's a consistent thread across 4 decades of interviews. A man who built his name playing villains on screen while insisting, off-screen, on a code of loyalty and self-respect he refused to compromise, regardless of what it cost him professionally. That same loyalty shaped some of his steadiest professional relationships, particularly his long-running collaboration with Tyler Perry, whose productions kept Powell working consistently even during years when other doors were quietly closing elsewhere in the industry. Powell has said Perry's sets offered something increasingly rare for him, an environment built by a black producer who understood exactly the kind of versatility Powell had spent his whole career trying to prove he had, moving him fluidly between comedic supporting turns and heavier dramatic roles without ever boxing him into a single note. It's part of why, even during his lowest professional years, Powell never fully disappeared from screens. A steady stream of television and film work that kept his name circulating long enough for audiences to eventually see the fuller picture of everything he'd actually been carrying.
And it cost him plenty, well before any courtroom ever entered the picture. Powell married Kimberly Powell, and the couple raised 2 children together, Clifton Jr. and Maya, building what looked from the outside like a stable Hollywood family for more than 2 decades, a genuine rarity by industry standards. But the demands of a working actor's life, constant travel, long stretches on location, the pull of an industry that rewards being everywhere at once, steadily wore the marriage down. Powell has since spoken with unusual honesty about his own role in that breakdown, admitting he ran with people he shouldn't have, that he gambled heavily, sometimes $30,000 to $50,000 a year at casinos, and that he simply wasn't present enough for his own children during years he can never get back. "I wasn't there for my kids like I should have been," he said plainly, adding that being away half the time might have been survivable, but the 70% he actually logged was too much. The divorce that eventually followed cost him millions, and by his own account, left him at one particularly low point years later, essentially starting over financially in his 60s. Even so, he's spoken warmly and often about both his children in the years since. Describing his son as a writer and athlete he's tried hard to raise with the gentleness and responsibility he didn't always receive himself, and crediting Kimberly, whatever the marriage's ultimate strain, with staying present for their kids in ways he admits he sometimes wasn't. It was against that already unstable backdrop that the legal fight Powell now describes as the most painful stretch of his adult life began. In late August of 2011, a woman working as a cocktail waitress at Harrah's Casino in New Orleans, who had known Powell for roughly 2 years, spent time with him following an evening encounter at the casino. She later filed a police report alleging the encounter turned non-consensual, a claim New Orleans police investigated and ultimately declined to pursue criminally, citing insufficient evidence. The woman, suing under the pseudonym Keontae Myers to protect her identity, then pursued a civil case against Powell in federal court, seeking damages in excess of $75,000.
Powell denied the allegations from the very beginning and has maintained his innocence in every interview since. The civil case itself dragged on for years and took several unexpected turns. In 2013, a default judgment was entered against Powell after his attorney failed to appear in court, finding him liable on the underlying civil claims. A result, Powell has said, blindsided him completely, insisting he was never properly informed of the hearing. He spent the years that followed fighting to have that default vacated, a process that ate up time, money, and by his own description, whatever peace of mind he had left. The case finally concluded in 2017 and 2018, with the underlying claims not proceeding further, and Powell's own countersuit for defamation and emotional distress ultimately dismissed as well on procedural grounds. Since Louisiana law requires defamation claims to be filed within a strict one-year window that had already passed. No criminal charges were ever filed against Powell at any point in the entire ordeal. Whatever the tangled procedural history, Powell has been unwavering in describing the toll the accusation itself took on him, independent of how the courts ultimately sorted it out. He's noted correctly that civil cases operate on a far lower legal standard than criminal ones, a preponderance of the evidence, rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which meant that even without ever facing a criminal charge, he remained entangled for years in a fight that could sink his reputation regardless of the outcome. He said the emotional weight of it rivaled losing his own father decades earlier, that as a man with a daughter of his own, the implication cut somewhere words could barely reach. He's described watching roles simply vanish without explanation, recalling one series where he expected to appear across 7 or 8 episodes, only to see his part disappear after the second, with casting offices citing nothing more specific than concerns tied to what people were reading online. He's talked about walking down familiar streets and reading suspicion in strangers' faces, about online comments convicting him long before any court ever weighed in, about a business that in his experience moves at the speed of a headline rather than the speed of due process. In an industry where perception routinely outruns fact, Powell has said plainly, a man can end up serving a sentence no judge ever actually handed down. By his own account, the combined weight of the divorce, the gambling, and the years of vanished work eventually caught up with him in a way few of his fans ever knew about. Powell has said that at his lowest point, not long after the divorce was finalized, he found himself essentially homeless, a stunning admission from a man whose face had appeared in more than 100 films by that point. He's described it as rock bottom in the truest sense, the moment everything he'd built since Mayfair Mansions seemed to collapse. At once, temptation, bad decisions, and a legal cloud all converging in the same handful of years. What pulled him back, by his own telling, was the same instinct that had carried him out of that DC housing project decades earlier, sheer refusal to stay down, coupled with the steady grind of taking whatever work was still available and rebuilding one credit at a time. These days, Powell has increasingly turned that same instinct outward, positioning himself as something of a Daryl Harvey figure for younger performers coming up behind him, the same role a teenager once played for an 8-year-old version of himself in a DC apartment complex. He's spoken about wanting his own son to carry forward a gentleness and sense of responsibility he says
he wasn't always taught himself. And he's used his platform at panels, in interviews, and in a memoir he's said he's been working on, to be unusually candid with younger black actors about exactly what the industry will and won't tell them outright about colorism, about how quickly perception can override fact, and about the real cost of staying silent when something on set genuinely isn't right. At 70, Powell keeps working steadily, the same way he always has, with credits across television and film that now number well past 200 recent projects, including Saints and Sinners, and a string of independent films that keep his name in front of audiences who never stopped showing up for him. His net worth is estimated today at roughly $5 million, a fraction of what it might have been without the divorce and the years of lost momentum, but a testament all the same to a career that has simply refused to end. His fans, many of whom have followed him since Friday first hit theaters in the mid-1990s, have been especially vocal in recent years. Under interviews where he's discussed the ordeal, comment sections fill with the same sentiment. Again and again, viewers writing that they're glad the legal fight is behind him, but sorry for how he was treated along the way. Others simply calling him a brilliant, versatile actor who deserved better than what the headlines gave him. Some fans have gone further, questioning openly whether black actors in his position face a harsher, faster verdict in the court of public opinion than their white counterparts, typically do a question Powell himself has raised in his own interviews, without ever claiming to have a tidy answer. What's clear, watching those comment sections fill week after week, is that a large and loyal audience never stopped believing in him. Even during the years Hollywood itself seemed unsure what to do with him. When an accusation alone is enough to end an actor's momentum long before any court has the final say, who actually protects people like Clifton Powell while the process plays out? And do you think Hollywood judges black actors caught in that position differently than everyone else? Tell us honestly and thoughtfully what you think in the comments below. We genuinely read every single one. If this story moved you, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe for more of the real stories behind the actors who raised us, and we'll see you in the next one.